All right, so I can't guarantee quality here, but at least you'll get to hear everything that we're doing on the review for my online guys. It's good to have you guys with me. Okay, so take that sheet of paper, even if you're online, if you want to take notes right now, so you kind of have them in one area. Those that are my online people here too, so that it's not going through and trying to search out books and Google and everything. You are going to find that you do much better and that the grades tend to be better when we do this review just to jog your memory and then go right into the test. It just typically works better that way. Okay, so format questions. Let's start with that. The test is 60 questions, multiple choice. Okay, 60 questions, multiple choice. We have covered a total of 5 chapters. So you do the math. That's roughly about 12 questions per chapter. It's not an exact science. They may ask a few more from one chapter than the other, but they tend to try to make it appropriately per each chapter. They try to balance it out, okay? The test is timed at 75 minutes. Most students, on average, finish in about 20 to 25 minutes for the 60 questions. My grades typically, if I had to score at difficulty level 1 to 10, Ms. Curry, what would you say it is? I'd say probably like a 4. Right? So it's not easy breezy, like where you think you could just go in and no-brain it, but neither is it. I had someone in my last class, they were taking a class the same time they were doing business communications, and they were like, this isn't easy breezy, but my other test I just finished took 4 hours to take because it was short answer. It's not going to be something like that, so you can, feel good about that. I was going to tell you guys something else to be prepared. Oh, the other question that I typically get is, other than how long do you think it'll take, how many questions, is about the grammar. Because you guys tend to panic about the grammar quizzes that you've been taking. Those grammar quizzes are little bullets. They are a little difficult. They're meant to have a little bit of bite, but they're not very weighty on your overall grade. There are grammar questions on the test, but not grammar questions like what you've been seeing on the Canvas quizzes. So it's not going to give you 4 sentences and say which one is punctuated correctly. The only grammar stuff it will refer back to, and you'll see in a minute when I'm going through it with you, is things that we've actually talked about in class or done activities for. And so for my online guys, it would be things you've actually seen in the chapter or done activities for. And so they'll say, which of the following is an independent clause? Because we talked about what was independent and what was dependent. And again, it's not a lot. Think about in that chapter, maybe 2 or 3 of the questions are going to be like that in the 12 for that chapter. So nothing too weighty. All right. So first thing you need to remember is there are 3 basic functions when we are trying to communicate in the business world. Okay? 3 basic functions. What are those functions? We're always trying to do what? Inform, persuade, or promote goodwill. Okay? Those are 3 things that we're constantly trying to do. If we're writing because we want to let you know something. We want to inform you about something. Or we want to persuade you to do something, buy something, join something, help with something, purchase something, change something. Okay? Or we're just promoting goodwill within the community or the company. All right? What is an advantage? One of the things we talked about oral communication versus written communication. This review is a little harder than what you think. I have to do a good review without giving away the farm, so to speak. So some of the advantages of written communication. Why would I write something down? We talked a lot about face-to-face communication and oral communication being one of the richest forms, one of the richest channels. When you can do face-to-face communication, you should, because it is one of the best ways to communicate. But there are sometimes we need to do written communication. And what would be one of the major benefits for doing something written instead of orally? You can revisit it later because it is a permanent record, right? So when we write things down, then it's there, right? It's not just when we speak, it's just kind of out there, and we can kind of think that we remember what we said or have a gist to what we said. But if we can get back to it because it was written, that is a permanent record, okay? Why would you say that face-to-face communication is one of the richest channels of communication? Why face-to-face? We talked about that. Because you get that immediate feedback. What do you feel feel like is now that we've discussed, even today, chapter 7 has helped a little bit on what you're going to be tested on, even though we're not testing on chapter 7, but they're so good in this book about going back over certain premises and certain foundational information. What would you say is probably the most predominant channel that we use in the business world today for communicating? Email by far. Okay, we talked a lot about, well, we didn't talk a lot about, but your chapter did go into a little bit of detail about what we would call internal organizational communication and external communication. So what is the difference? What's internal, or maybe give me an example of what's internal communication versus external organization communication. What would be the difference? Right, when we're communicating inside the organization, like with fellow co-workers, that's definitely internal. If I'm writing a letter out to my shareholders, right, that's going to be external. I'm going outside of the organization for that. So you need to know the difference between internal organizational communication and external. We need to remember that on the spectrum, when we're picking, we've talked about a lot of different channels that we have for communicating, right? We've got email, we've got text messaging, we've got face-to-face, we have blogging, we have vlogging, we have video conferences, video chatting, vlogging, not just blogging. So we have all these wonderful channels now that we're able to utilize for communication. However, we find that there is this spectrum, right? And we saw it up on the PowerPoint when we did it, where it started with that richest form face-to-face, and then it kind of categorized them and went down, you know, as its effectiveness decreased, right? So my question to you would be, if the situation and what you're trying to communicate, what you're trying to convey is very complex, do you want to be on this side of the spectrum, like with face-to-face communication, on a rich side, or do you want to be on lower? So as like, how does that move with complexity of what you're trying to communicate?
The more complex, the more richer you want it.
That's exactly right. So the more complex the topic that you're trying to convey, the richer the medium you need, the richer the channel you need. And what's the richest channel?
Face-to-face.
There you go. Okay, we didn't talk a lot about this, so I'm just going to put it out there for you. So in today's companies, a lot of companies, this is now we're kind of segueing, they're starting to reach into the next chapter a little bit. They're going to ask a few more from chapter 1, but they're already kind of heading into chapter 2. But to improve communication, everything now is about teamwork, right? And working in groups. So no longer are they trying to have all these levels. They're actually trying to, we talked about level the playing field, so to speak, so that, you know, the CEO might be on the same group or working with the same team sometimes as just our lower level employees, so to speak. And so they've done away with all these levels, and they have instead, they want to have this free flow of communication. And so they've done that through all of this group work, and what they do is they break people into like little mini units. So they've restructured and re-engineered this huge vast company now into these little teams or these little groups, and that tends to work better. So if you know that, you'll know the question, okay? Because we didn't really explore that a lot. We need to know that there are certain things that are ethical when we're communicating. It's very important that people can look at us and think of us as being ethical communicators. And so obviously that means we always need to tell the truth. We need to be very careful about opinions and make sure we label what's our opinions, not to just state our opinions like it's fact, because that's a form of lying and that's unethical. We don't want to try to purposely confuse people with what's fact and what's our opinion. We want to make sure we're purposely communicating clearly. Some people will opt to not communicate clearly because they want things lost in the shuffle, so to speak. And so we have to be very careful about that. Another thing that's very important that people tend to do is they steal other people's ideas. They take pieces of what people are saying in group work and in teamwork now, and they'll try to portray that as their own. And that is not ethical. To be ethical when we're talking about things that have been discussed as teams is that we give people their right due. We let people know this was James's idea, or Sophia mentioned this in our group discussion, instead of just taking it as our own. Here's a question, and we definitely hit on this. Nonverbal communication, is that only done through, can that be done in a written manner? Can you show forth nonverbal communication through your writing, through your business communication, through writing, through written communication? Let's think about it this way. You guys are kind of split. So let's think about it this way. If I brought you an inner office memo that was, kind of wrinkled up like this, and I had kind of made my own marks on it, whatever, and then I say, oh, this is kind of important, you might want to read that. Does this look kind of important to you? Right, so is that some type of nonverbal communication that's coming across to you that I didn't find that this was important enough to do it in a nice manner and to make it neat and nice? So you can have nonverbal communication through written expression. All right, we talked a lot about, in the first couple chapters, the difference between hard skills and soft skills. So someone define those for me. Give me the difference between hard skills and soft skills. Or give me an example of a hard skill versus an example of a soft skill. Yes. So a great example of a soft skill is your ability to communicate, written or orally, right? Being on time, being ethical, being honest, all those soft skills, right? So what would be an example of hard skills? Working well with a team is a soft skill. That's why it's in chapter 2. Hard skills are like, can you run Microsoft Word? Can you program a computer? Do you know how to weld this part to this part? Like, those are hard skills. Many moons ago, we focused so much on hard skills that we found that we were just assuming that people knew soft skills, how to work on teams, right? And then we had companies coming to us and CEOs coming to us and going to textbook companies and saying, if you want to know where the money's at, we need help knowing that's hard for us to teach. You teach the soft skills. We can teach the hard skills in the first 2 weeks or 2 months that they're here. And so they've kind of gone back to integrating these soft skills in, like working with teams, communicating better, those types of things. What is one of the benefits of, we talked about a lot, so tell me some of the benefits to working as teams. I force you guys constantly. I know online you guys feel like you have it worse because you're like, it's hard to work with a group online and virtually, but you guys only have to do it twice. You have to do it for your APA project, and then you're gonna have to do it for your presentation. But these guys, if you could see them, they're all shaking their head. Yes, every week we work in groups here. I force you at some point in the class to get together and work as a group. And so what are some of the advantages? Why do we push that? Why do we push teamwork and group work? What are some of the advantages of
More ideas.
a better diverse group of ideas? What else?
Problem solving.
Problem solving is better and easier with teamwork. You're faster to get your answers with team solutions. Another thing is, remember we talked about what would happen if I said, okay, I have to cut back overtime, right? And so we've got to have a solution about how we're going to do this a little bit differently. And we talked about putting that to a team to come up with that resolve, because it would do what?
Oh, it would, your buy-in.
Yes, it's going to help tremendously with buy-in. So that's another benefit. All of these things that you've said, those are great benefits to teamwork, but I didn't want you to exclude buy-in. There's less chance of team members resisting that change or resisting what's coming down the pike if some of their own colleagues have been a part of making that decision and coming up with that change. So far, so good? We're good? Okay. We're about a quarter of a way there. The most effective groups try not to fall prey to what we call groupthink, right? We don't just hear what the leader says and everybody just shakes their head and become yes men. We don't want to conform to that. But instead, we do want to, at the beginning, establish rules and say, this is how we're going to order this team, or this is how we're going to order this group, this is how it's going to work, this is how we're going to make our final decision. So we outline the rules and what everybody needs to play by, so to speak. And the good team members not only establish those rules, but follow those rules. We have to know that, and we talked about this, there's going to be conflict. There's always going to be conflict. Is conflict a bad thing? It can be if it gets out of control, but conflict can also bring about some of the best decisions and some of the best solutions, because we don't want groupthink. So there needs to be a certain amount of conflict to kind of counteract that groupthink. So conflict isn't always a bad thing. Typically it's a normal part. You just need to know how to work around that conflict and how to use it. If we're making any major decisions and we're working as a group to make those decisions, do I want 25, 35, 45 people on my team when I'm making decisions? No. What do I want to limit my teams to when I'm making good decisions?
4 to 5.
Yeah, about 5 or fewer. Yeah, about a handful is what you want. One good way, we saw a good video. So since we did this video wise and not so much in the chapter for you guys, my live group here, we talked about becoming a more effective listener. That was a piece of the chapter in talking about groups. And to be a better team member, you have to be a better listener. And so there were some things that she talked about on the video. Great video. It's one of your options for your extra credit. We'll talk about extra credit at the end of this. But one of the things she said, she kind of dismissed it, but your book still pushes it. Therefore, you could see it on the test. But they do say to understand and to be a better listener, a lot of times if you can rephrase and summarize what the person has said to you, you're able to rephrase it, then that works. She talked a little bit kind of anti that with one of the comments she made, but I don't think she actually, I think they mean two different things. Most people are more successful on studying if they think they're studying, we talked about this last week, to teach. So when you think you're studying to teach someone something, you usually do better on passing an exam than if you think I'm just studying to take an exam. It's kind of weird, but that's kind of the idea of rephrasing, re-summarizing what you've learned in a lecture, like you're going to teach it back. That helps. That's it's a tremendous help. Lots of forms of nonverbal communication. If I'm yelling when I'm presenting, is that nonverbal? Yeah, I'm definitely giving you more than just what my actual words are saying if I'm elevating my voice level like that. We talked about ways to do nonverbal in written, given a sloppy document. That's definitely a form of nonverbal communication. Showing up late to an interview. That's nonverbal communication. That's showing you I don't care really if I get this job or not. Or what you think about me because I'm late. What I want is more important. So all of those are forms of nonverbal communication. Is getting back, which is more important? Getting back quickly or answering correctly? Right. We want to make sure, we don't want to just say, well, I need to respond quickly. And you may need to, but you can't sacrifice errors just for the sake of saying, well, I respond in, 2 hours or less when I get an email, but the emails that are going back out are atrocious, okay? We didn't talk a lot about this, but it's kind of just like I think maybe something you would just know and you guys could just feel just from the information that we've been getting over the last couple of weeks. But the term work has changed tremendously and what we think about when we say, I'm going to work. Now that we've developed virtual teams, you guys have been collaborating, especially on online groups, virtually. Working on an assignment is a lot different now. When we say, I'm going to work on an assignment or I'm going to work, we used to think about that as a geographical thing, only a location thing, right? I'm going to work. So we thought immediately, I'm going to this specific geographic location, or I'm going to work on an assignment with my team. I'm going specifically to the library or whatever. Now when we say, I'm going to work, it's not held within a geographic zone anymore. Now it's more about what you're going to do rather than where you're going to go do it. How do we know we've communicated successfully? I know we talked about this. We talked about the circle of communication and how it goes in this, first we get an idea, and then we code that idea, we pick that channel, and then we send it. Now the receiver receives it, they decode it, and then they give us what back? Yeah, and we don't really know if what we've sent, we truly communicated the point we were trying to make until we get that feedback. Until we get that feedback, we don't know if we were just kind of shooting in the dark. We may think 100%, oh, that was so easy to understand. But we've learned in other chapters there's things that prevent, us, that true understanding. So you got to be careful. When we're deciding what form, like if I'm like trying to figure out, okay, do I need to send this email? Do I need to send this face to face? I'm trying to pick a what? A channel. Okay, we talked about this. We were just talking about things that get in the way of us actually, somebody being able to decode properly what we were trying to send. We coded it this way, thinking it would be clear, but sometimes things get in the way of our decoding. One of those things is what we call bypassing. And so there's these words that we use a lot in the business realm that not everybody has the same definition for. So for instance, we talked about, I need to get some help. And we thought when we volunteered to go put on stamps, we talked about that they were getting some help. They meant like 10 employees, so we're going to be done with this an hour, only to find out some help meant just me. And now I'm there for 3 hours. So words like probably, usually there's a lot of people there. Okay, what's usually? Or when we say like soon, can you have this done soon? My soon may be in 2 hours and your soon may be next week, And so that's called bypassing when we use these, it's a communication barrier. Let's see, what else? I think we covered that quite a bit. Difference of frame is another barrier that we talked about in the book. And that just simply means that different people come from different cultures, different backgrounds. They have different experiences. People that grew up in another country are going to have a different bubble, than we do a lot of times. And they're going to understand things a lot differently. And that's called differences in frames. And that can be a barrier as well to communication, just like bypassing can. Another communication barrier that we mentioned that was mentioned in the book and that we talked about on the overhead was digital interruptions. Learning to, when we're communicating, to put things away that won't try to force us to multitask. Research shows there's no such thing. We think multitasking is this amazing thing, and it's a cool term that we've used over the last decade because we're doing more. But research and science has shown, science on our brain shows that part of that brain can only handle one thing at a time. There's no way to multitask. You say, well, I know such and such, and she, does well. In fact, I have a mentor. She's now she's just a friend, but she was a lot younger than me, and now she basically rules the world. I mean, she's amazing at all the things that she does. And she would tell instructors when she was coming to college, please do not be offended if I pull out my checkbook and I'm balancing my checkbook while you're lecturing. I promise I'm listening. And she was, but it was just something with her brain that if it wasn't constantly, in go mode, she would just turn off. And so she actually did hear the lecture better when she had menial task or something to her that was kind of just menial to do. That's really not the case. That's very rare. Most of the time we can't handle digital interruptions and trying to multitask in that way. We're about halfway there, guys. You're doing good. Never write unless you have a purpose for writing. We don't just write to write. We don't just have meetings to have meetings. We don't just send emails for the sake of sending emails. I feel very guilty sometimes with my online class because I feel compelled to touch base with you guys at least once a week via an email or a video because I just feel like you're out there, right? But I also am torn because I know good business etiquette is not just to send something if there's not a good purpose behind it. Most of the time, there's at least some purpose behind it. If I'm just communicating once a week, like, hey, don't forget this homework. So we could say that that's a purpose, but I feel very torn a lot of times because of that need to feel connected versus do I really have a true purpose? So make sure that you have a purpose before you ever start writing or communicating. Really love that they do in here, that 3x3 writing process. The first step is what? pre-writing. In that pre-writing step, we're doing things like analyzing our audience, thinking about our purpose, like we just talked about. That's all in that first phase. What's the second phase? Then we draft, and then the third phase, revising, which is what we talked about last week. Where do we spend most of our time? In the pre-writing, drafting, or revising? Revising by 50%. Usually it's 25, 25, and then 50 in that revising stage. Because we revise for so much more than just spelling, right? That's just one of those things that we do. Remember, 3 primary purposes. We started with this. You're writing to typically inform, or to persuade, or to promote goodwill. So if I'm writing to a vendor, trying to get them to be a part of something that I'm doing for charity, what type of writing am I probably going to be using? Right, I'm trying to persuade them to do something. So it's usually one of those 3 main purposes that we're trying to fulfill: to inform, to persuade, or just to promote goodwill. When I'm sitting and they ask the same types of questions, guys, just note, but they ask them different ways. So if I'm sitting at my desk and I'm trying to figure out, okay, should I do this via email? Should I walk over to his office and talk to him face to face? Should I put together an inter-office memo? I'm again trying to figure what out. What type of channel? What's the most appropriate channel that I should be using? When we're picking a channel, there's a lot of things that we have to think about, right? So we've got to think about the knowledge that someone has. If we're trying to communicate with a customer that's 80 plus, email may not be the best way, right? What might be better to do? Pick up the phone and call, or face to face, right? So if we know that we have to go by what the receiver prefers, and we talked about that. Remember, I talked about my friend. She will not answer email. She will not even answer a phone call anymore. She only answers text messaging. And so I'm one of her best friends, and she can see my name on caller ID, and she is probably 9 out of 10 times, unless she knows it's at a fluke time or something's going on with me, she's probably not going to answer. But then I can text and say, hey, sweetie, I want to talk about blah, blah, blah. Can you call me? Then I might get a call back, but usually she's going to text me back. It's just her form. That's just her preference. And so we need to know how versed are they in the channel that I'm fixing to use? What is their preference in the channels? That kind of thing. All of those weigh in when we're trying to make a decision. All right, so some grammar stuff. An independent clause is a clause that has a subject and a verb and can stand by itself. If it's independent, right, it's on its own. It can stand alone. A dependent clause will have a subject and a verb, but it cannot stand alone. So they'll give you an italicized phrase or clause or sentence, and they'll say, true or false, this is an independent clause, right? So you look at it and you tell me, can it stand alone, right? Does it make sense by itself, okay? A lot of times, if it has what we call a subordinating conjunction at the beginning of it, it can't stand by itself, right? So like a when, or although, or whenever, one of those kind of things. Again, not a lot of questions like that. I'm looking at one. And then they ask at least 2 questions having you identify this sentence is in active voice, true or false. This sentence is in passive voice, true or false. So remember, active voice is when the subject is actually performing the action, okay? Brandy wrote a letter. I'm the subject, Brandy. I'm actually performing the action. Most times, to make our writing powerful in business writing, we want to write in active voice, right? Business writing is all about getting to the point, right? Who did it? What did they do? Boom, right? But there's a few times we want to go into passive voice when we're delivering negative news, when we're trying to persuade someone and we don't want them to know quite yet we're trying to persuade them. Then we would bring out of our toolbox, so to speak, passive voice. So remember, with the activities that we did, you had to change to, and we changed it to an error was made by Michelle. So instead of saying Michelle made an error, that would be active, and it really puts a lot of emphasis on that subject, who did it. But if we're wanting to kind of de-emphasize that, We're going to go to passive and say an error was made. Did the error actually do something? No, Michelle's the one that did it. So that in that case, the subject's not doing the action, it's kind of receiving the action. So we call that passive. So again, we've done some activities with it. It was in the chapter, but they're going to ask you at least 2 questions about active and passive voice. They'll also probably ask you one, if I'm not mistaken, it comes up a little later. It'll say, which of the following would you want to use passive voice in? And we just talked about some of those things. If I'm giving negative news, if I'm trying to persuade, those are, if I'm trying to de-emphasize who did it, who did the whoops, then that would be passive voice. When we're getting ready to write, whether it's a proposal or an email, one of the first things we need to do and think about as we're gathering information to write that email or to write that proposal is we need to think about what do our clients already know, because that will kind of help us to know, do we want to write in a direct pattern, an indirect pattern? How much do they already know about this topic? Okay. We talked about informal and formal research methods. Remember that inside that realm of informal was like looking at company files. We're not going outside, right, to do something. When we start going to other libraries and going to like public and college libraries, that's going to be very formal because now we're going outside of the company to do it. But when we're asking our boss extra questions, surveying people in our building, those types of things, that's informal. Externals, when we start going out, that becomes formal. It's very important in the drafting process when we get to that stage, now that we know what channel we're using, what our purpose is, who our audience is, and now we start organizing, that we group ideas together. It's very important for your APA project as well, right? That's why headings are great with APA. So you say introduction, and you know to put all of your sentences about introductory information up there. We're talking background, and you subdivide that background information up. You know exactly where to organize those thoughts and group those ideas together. It's very important when organizing that we know what to group together. Usually you're going to break major components into like 2 subheadings. You don't want to get crazy and do it in 10. You don't want to try to do it all in one set. But usually if you have an A, you have a B. If you have a 1, you have a 2. And you don't want to get too much further out than that, okay? Direct pattern, most of the time you want to use direct pattern when you're writing in business because we're short, sweet, hard to beat. We want to get right to the point, right? So when we're doing direct pattern, if we were trying to like explain how to do something, there's no sense in beating around the bush. We just come right out and say, this is how you fix your blades. Take them out, you flip the rotator, you hook it back on. There's no need to beat around the bush. Now we would go to an indirect pattern if, again, we're trying to fire someone or tell them their benefits have been cut, or we're trying to persuade them to do something that would cost them a lot of money or a lot of time. Then we would move to an indirect pattern. But most of the time you're going to want to follow direct pattern. A clause is different than a phrase, okay? A clause is different than a phrase. A clause is going to have a subject and a verb in it, but it may not be able to stand on its own, but it's going to have a subject and a verb. A phrase could be like a prepositional phrase, like on Monday. Is that a clause? No, that's just a prepositional phrase. It starts with the preposition on, ends with the subject Monday. But there's no subject and there's no verb in that, okay? So a clause can be independent or dependent, but it's going to have a subject and a verb in it. What's a compound sentence?
2 independent sentences.
You get the bonus, right? Yeah, that's exactly right. So compound is when we have 2 independent. So 2 sentences that could completely stand by themselves, and we put them together. There's a proper way to put them together with a comma and a coordinating conjunction, or a semicolon, or even a semicolon and a transitional expression and a comma. But when we put 2 sentences that could stand by themselves as one, that's compound, like a compound word, butter and fly. But 2 sentences together working as one. When one's independent and dependent, that's a whole different thing. That's complex, okay? They don't ask you about a complex, though. What happens when we take, like we just said, two independent clauses, okay, and we put them together, but we just do it with a little comma? What's that called? That's a comma splice, right? So it's a run-on, but there's a specific kind of run-on. It's either a fused or a comma splice. If they put the comma, that's a comma splice. If they put nothing, that's just fused. They're going to ask you about splices. We can emphasize specific words, like the client. If we want to emphasize the client by putting it as the subject, putting it first, right? So that's one way we can emphasize. And when we get really good at writing, and see, that's where you guys are trying to get. All of this right now, your head's swimming right now. You're like, all these things. But the better you get at all of these things, your communication skills, you're going to learn these tactics that you pull out at certain times. Oh, I'm going to use indirect. I'm trying to persuade them to spend a lot of money right now. So I'm going to go into indirect. I've got to let them know this bad news that I'm cutting their benefits by half. I'm going to go into indirect. I want them to know for sure, and I know with this particular client, I can't hem-haw around. I'm using direct, right? So you'll learn these things and how to emphasize, how to de-emphasize, when to use passive, when to use active, because of what you're trying to do. You're controlling your audience. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to persuade, control, inform your audience in such a way that they're pliable to you and what you're wanting done. And you can do that with all of these cool things we've been learning about already in these first 6 chapters. We're almost done. We've talked a lot about active. There's another 2 questions, again, like, when would you use active? When would you use passive? When would you use active? When would you use passive? One question on parallelism. Most of you on the activity, you nailed that part. That was the easy part. It was the dangling modifiers, online dangling modifiers. You guys didn't get that. But those are kind of hard. Also, you writing is really hard for students, and we talked about that. But they don't give you a lot of questions about for whatever you view, but they do ask you about parallelism, but I don't think any of you will have trouble with that because most of you just kind of aced that. Get rid of redundancies. They're going to ask you some examples. Which of the following is not a redundancy? If I say combine together, is that a redundancy? Yes, because combining is together. And so they'll give you 4 double words, and you're looking for the one that's not redundancy. Combined together would be a redundancy. So those types of things. Then they ask you, which of the following is the best writing? So what they're trying to do is get you to pick the one that doesn't have the crazy long lead-in or the extra trite expressions, like please do not hesitate. We overuse that so much. That's a trite expression. So they're going to ask you a lot of questions like that on the last 10. We want to always keep business writing what? Short, sweet, hard to beat, right? Short and simple, short and simple. Get rid of long lead-ins. Get rid of redundancies. Get rid of trite expressions. Those expressions that we use over and over again in the business world. We're just like beating them to death, right? Like phrases like enclose, please find. Please don't hesitate to. What's some more? Under separate cover. That's kind of one that's overused. We have received, or no, not that one. Enclose, please find. Okay. So you don't want to use any of those. Those are trite expressions. We don't want to use slang, or buzzwords. We want the cleanest looking sentences when they're asking you, which of the following is the best writing? You're looking for the ones without those slang words, without those trite expressions, without those long lead-ins. Something that's really clear and to the point. When we're proofreading, it's very difficult sometimes because what? We know what we meant to write, but for whatever reason, so our brain doesn't pick up the mistakes. It's like we don't want to find the mistakes and we fill in the gaps because we know what we meant. So catching errors can become difficult because of that. When we're revising, we talked about so many things that we're revising for, not just spelling, definitely punctuation, definitely grammar, but we're also checking for names and numbers. We're also checking our formatting. We're making sure we use good white space. So many elements to revising. So remember all of those elements. One freebie I'm going to give you. When we're writing something, if I'm checking something and let's say somebody had written my name like this and you see 3 underlines underneath it, what does that typically mean? Right, that's the only proofreading. There was, remember, we kind of skipped through on the PowerPoint, they gave you kind of a list of proofreading things, and I told you, don't worry about it, I'll tell you which one's on the test. That's the one on the test. And flabby expressions are usually when we use 2 or 3 words, and we could have just condensed it down to what? One word. Right? Instead of shaking 50 times when I'm doing my hair, this shouldn't be shaken at all, or at least just once, right? But it shakes too many times because it's flabby. So we want to get it down to 1 word. All right, that is the test. How do you feel? Any questions that you feel like you need to ask me before I turn you loose? Something that I brought up or mentioned that you just feel like you don't understand? Okay, guys, do good.